Will the world have enough fuel to fill the tank and to fertilize the crops? The seizure of ships by Iran this Wednesday, adding to global jitters as the extension of a ceasefire offers, well, zero visibility on prospects for the planet's biggest choke point for oil and gas. Nearly 2 months on, the Paris-based International Energy Agency is already calling this the biggest ever energy disruption in history. We'll ask about prices at the pump, canceled flights. More broadly, if oil's not flowing through the Strait of Hormuz, where to find it and what's the alternative? Cue images of the French president who staged his Wednesday cabinet meeting in the central Allier region, where Emmanuel Macron also inaugurated a large lithium mine. How fast can the energy transition make up for lost oil? How much of a bind for Europe, where harmony among the 27 rests on Russian oil flowing through the eastern members through the Druzhba pipeline, and when China's dominance of the battery and electric vehicle markets makes it hard, very hard, for the West to compete. Today in the France 24 debate, how to handle what may become the world's worst energy crisis. With us from Washington, Noam Redan, Senior Fellow at the Washington Institute for Near East Policy think tank. Welcome back to the show.
Thank you.
From Oxford, England, Jan Rosenau, Professor of Energy and Climate Policy at Oxford University. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
Hélène Conway-Mouret, Socialist Vice Chair of the French Senate's Foreign Affairs and Defense Committee. Good to see you.
Hello.
And Philippe Charlet, Energy Analyst at Le Millénaire think tank. Welcome back to the show. On the go, you can listen to the show wherever podcasts are streamed. Yeah, the price of Brent crude oil back above $100 a barrel. This despite Donald Trump's truce extension announcement, which started our day here. Iran taking its time returning to the bargaining table while seizing 2 container ships, apparent payback for Sunday's capture of an Iranian vessel. Karis Garland has more.
In central Tehran, the mood at this pro-government rally was festive and the message defiant. With missiles and launches on display, the event can be interpreted as a signal to Israel and the US, who devoted much of their airstrike campaign to destroying Iran's ballistic missile arsenal. Tehran didn't immediately acknowledge an extension of the ceasefire with the US. Instead, it appeared to dig in its heels after Washington said it would maintain its naval blockade of Iranian ports. The Revolutionary Guard said it seized 2 container ships trying to cross the Strait of Hormuz, identifying one as the MSC Francesca and the other as Epaminondas, which they said was tampering with navigation systems and jeopardizing maritime security. According to tracking data from marine traffic, the 2 vessels were stopped off the coast of Iran's Bandar Sirik. Iranian news agency Tasnim said one of the ships ignored warnings from the army, though the United Kingdom's Maritime Trade Operations Centre disputed that claim.
The master of a container ship reported that the vessel was approached by one IRGC gunboat. No radio challenge, that then fired upon the vessel, which has caused heavy damage to the bridge. No fires or environmental impact reported. All crew reported safe.
Several Iranian media outlets also reported an attack on a vessel called the Euphoria. According to marine traffic, the container ship was traveling from Jebel Ali in the United Arab Emirates to Jeddah in Saudi Arabia. There are fears that without a permanent diplomatic solution between Iran and the US, these attacks in the Strait could continue, further squeezing supplies of global energy, as well as other essential products like fertilizers.
Noam Redan in Washington, what do you make of the timing and of, again, these 3 ships reportedly being fired upon?
This is not surprising at all. Over the weekend, we saw at least 3 ships that encountered Iranian gunboats in the Strait of Hormuz and were forced to go back into the Gulf region. Those included at least 2 India-flagged oil tankers and also a France-flagged container ship owned by Sam Al-Sajjam, based on the reports available right now. We should expect Iran to continue escalating. I've warned about this in my posts and also in my work. They will not let go of this leverage on the Strait of Hormuz. They will tighten control. Previously, they were allowing, for instance, Pakistan-linked ships and India-linked ships to pass through the strait. Now, they're not being allowed. We should expect them to continue their control on the path blockade is in place.
Yeah, apologies. Connection just a little bit choppy there. So, Noam, you're not expecting them. What is this? Just leverage before they go to the bargaining table, or are they not interested in going to the bargaining table?
They're using the Strait of Hormuz. This is their strongest card right now in order to extract concessions. I've said it before. We should not expect the Iranians not to try to get concessions out of the talks in Pakistan. Strait of Hormuz is their strongest card. Let me put this in context. We have around 20 million barrels per day of crude oil plus oil products that used to flow before the war. These have halted right now. We are not seeing tankers passing through the Strait of Hormuz to global markets. We're only seeing single digits. We're seeing 9, you're seeing 7, we're seeing 8, and probably right now we're not going to see non-Iranian or non-Iran linked ships passing through the strait. This is where the situation is. They are controlling, Iran is still controlling the flow of energy and other commodities to global markets. And they know because of this, that this is their strongest card in order to extract concessions. They will continue putting pressure on regional oil producers and exporters. And also this will definitely affect, as we know by now, importers around the world.
So let me ask
nothing
you.
Can substitute, nothing can substitute energy flows from the Middle East.
Yeah, nothing can substitute it. Let me ask you, we see the U.S. president who claims that the Iranians also are hurting from not having the oil flow out. We also see that the U.S. continues to send more troops. What cards does the United States have right now?
The United States is making efforts to put pressure on Iran, specifically on its ships to and from Iranian ports. So far, we've seen the United States seizing at least 2 ships. We saw the Tuska container ship. This one is Iran flagged over the weekend. We saw yesterday a tanker that is falsely flagged, not Iran flagged, tanker that was also seized. We should expect the U.S. to continue trying to put more pressure on Iran and the ships that are going to or coming from Iranian ports. How will this affect Iran? This is still unclear, but we should expect the U.S. to maintain the blockade on Iran as long as we're not seeing any progress in the talks between the two sides.
All right, so a standoff in that regard, and you mentioned how devastating it is for the rest of the planet. The peak supply loss from the current crisis stands at more than 12 million barrels a day. That's the equivalent of 11.5% of global oil demand, according to the International Energy Agency. To cushion the shock, the Paris-based IEA has released a record 400 million barrels from strategic stockpiles. Reuters journalist Alex Lawler compared with previous shocks, the 1973 Arab oil embargo, the fallout from the 1979 Iranian Revolution, and the 1991 Gulf War. Well, demand has since soared, along with global population. He says the world consumes much more gas than it did during the oil shocks of the 70s to the 90s. During the Arab oil embargo and the Iranian Revolution, the liquefied natural gas industry was nascent. Qatar first exported LNG in 1996. So, Jan Razenow, are you here to declare that this is indeed the world's worst ever energy crisis?
Well, it could certainly become one of the worst or the worst energy crisis the world has ever seen. The difference to the crisis in 2022, when we overnight lost pipeline gas in Europe from Russia after the invasion of Ukraine, is that this crisis is a little bit more incremental, I'd say, because per day, every day this goes on, we lose just a little bit more of supply of liquefied natural gas and oil around the world. And it's really cumulative. That is the effect that this crisis is having. A couple of days doesn't have a major impact, but we're now entering the third month in a couple of weeks of this crisis, and that will have lasting consequences for the economy, simply because we had such a long time of really quite significantly constrained supplies. So yes, it is a very serious situation, and I fear that we still haven't quite fully grasped the seriousness of the situation that we find ourselves in.
Yeah, since the 1990s, as we said, there's LNG that's become an industry, particularly for places like Qatar. But there's also the fact that the Gulf is heavily invested in things like refineries, that it exports jet fuels, that it exports fertilizers that are needed the world over.
That's right. I mean, this sends ripple effects right across the entire economy. And, the very immediate effect that people have seen was, just at the pump, right, when they tank their car, when they buy their petrol and their diesel. But we're now going to find food prices on the rise. It just takes time for that to filter through the economy. But the coming months, will be tough when it comes to inflation. We're going to see a significant rise in prices driven by the cost of fossil fuels, which are still underpinning 80% or so of our global energy system. And that's why it's such a serious situation.
Is there going to be a shortage of jet fuel this summer? We're seeing companies like Lufthansa and KLM, which are cutting down on their short-term flights.
There may well be. There certainly are reports that in Europe we are getting to a point where there might be shortages. We're already seeing that the cost of flights are going up by the day. So it is certainly feasible that we see much higher prices going forward, and that will of course have an impact on demand and therefore help with the shortages.
Hélène Conway-Mouret, what's the focus for lawmakers in France? We saw that there was the announcement made on Wednesday of a lowering of taxes at the pump by 20 cents. Is that where the focus is right now, on how to try to keep the price at the pump down?
Well, I suppose, you see, because of the uncertainty and every day, we believe that, yes, there is a ceasefire and it's the end of it. And then there is a new announcement by the American president, and, the situation seems to get worse and so on. So it's very difficult for governments to actually plan. They plan short term, trying to make sure that the public opinion stays calm, not to trigger social unrest. I mean, if we remember the episode with the
yellow vest began with a carbon tax.
Exactly. Yeah. So there is, from a political perspective, the ambition to try to keep social unrest away by announcing measures, but not in the long term, because everybody believes that the crisis will stop. But in effect, what the two speakers said, and I fully agree with their analysis, is that it is a very serious crisis which goes far beyond what we have had so far in the 1970s, the war in Iran and Iraq and so on. This is far worse, because this is not a regional war between Israel and Iran. It's an international war, because Israel drew the United States into that war. And now the United States cannot lose face. And therefore, we have an American president trying to make sure that, he will be the winner. And the Iranian people and government, who wants to do the same and has had a very, I think, intelligent strategy to involve the rest of the region by hitting all the oil-producing countries in the region. So it's not just a war between three countries, it's the whole region. And now, with the Strait of Hormuz being frozen, it's an economic crisis, at the world state, at the level of us. And it's one way, because we go back to the political question that you raised, Iran is playing a lot of cards extremely smartly because it's a way to actually divide us in the West. We do not support that war. The Europeans have declared all of us, the UK included, this is not our war. But we cannot go counter to what the United States are doing because there's the threat of pulling out of NATO and So all of that goes back to us being dependent outside of Europe, both for energy, for security, for a lot of things. And that's why you have the French president, in a mine, opening a mine, which we would not have done 5 years ago.
We're going to talk in a moment about that French president. But first, Philippe Chalais, you heard earlier Jan Rosano talking about how even if the Strait of Hormuz were to reopen tomorrow, we would feel the effects long after. How long after?
What I don't know today is, in fact, of course, the Strait of Hormuz is closed now for around 2 months. And there is not only a problem of passage, there is also a problem of storage, because currently in all the, not only in Iran, but all the countries around the Gulf, they had very probably, I have not the proof, but very probably they have to close the wells. And we know that in petroleum engineering, when you close a well and you reopen the well, it doesn't produce the same amount, especially the amount of water increase relative to the amount of oil. So it means that very probably even if today the Strait of Hormuz was reopening, very probably the production of the Gulf would not be the same as previous the war. However, we have to know that we were before the war in overproduction, overcapacity, I would say, production. So the world had around the capacity to produce 110 million barrels per day, and the consumption was in the range of 102. So it means that very probably the lack of production from the Gulf when the wells would be reopened could be compensated by other region in the world. So I am not too worried about that. I think that finally, even if there is perturbation during a few weeks, the normal situation, if the Gulf was reopened and the war stops, we would recover a normal situation quite quickly.
All right, that brings us back to what Hélène Conway-Mouret was referring to there. France doesn't have oil, but it has ideas. That was the saying after the 1973 OPEC oil embargo that we repeated often. Yeah,
I think I am the only one. No?
Turns out it also has lithium, key to making batteries. France's president inaugurating a brand new mine in Echassières, that's in the center of the country, which by the next decade could produce enough to equip 700,000 electric cars a year.
Today, we face terrible competition from China. You've experienced this in the steel industry, in the department, but prices are collapsing. When it comes to lithium, we face fierce competition from China. They're driving prices down to secure a monopoly, and so there's dumping fueled by overcapacity. On the other side, the Americans are responding with tariffs that affect us as well, and so we absolutely must have a French and European strategy to address this.
Good news, the opening of this lithium mine, Philippe Chalais?
First of all, we knew it for a few years that it was a clay mine initially, and in clay you have in fact part of lithium, and so effectively lithium extracted from mine, an open pit mine. Yes, it's a good news, but we know that we have big delay with respect to China in terms of electric cars, especially in terms of technology, but also in terms of prices. And so I'm not sure that we could recover this delay, and we can see that the car manufacturers are in very big difficulties. I suppose you have heard the closing of a big manufacturer of cars in Poissy, if I remember, of Stellantis.
Yes, that's in the western suburbs of Paris.
Currently, the car industry in Europe, it represents 15 million people, employment, including the para activities, and so they are in big danger. But I think that producing our own metals and our own, why not gas and oil, could be a good news currently, yes.
Right, certainly weaning themselves out, because again, we're looking for alternatives to that oil and gas. The French president who talked about, Hélène Conway-Mouret, streamlining the paperwork for getting regulatory approval. Environmentalists are not going to like about what he calls the simplification of environmental impacts studies, the simplification. So there's a cost when you open a mine. Lithium is not a lithium mine is not something that's clean. Is it though something you have to do if you want to wean yourself off of, again, oil and gas at this point?
Well, that's it. It's a very difficult choice because we're about the only continent that still believes in sustainable energy, I think, and the respect of international law, but also environmental law. I think it is to our honor to continue trying to protect our environment when we see what the impact of climate change costs, not just financially, with floods and droughts and tornadoes and storms and whatever, financial costs, but the human costs as well. I think we need to kind of try to hit a right balance by, yes, we need to be independent. We cannot just rely on other countries, as I say, for energy, for security, for everything. So we have to find ways. I just hope that the simplification doesn't mean that we write off everything and that the populations around will be badly affected and we might regret it then in a few years. But I think we do need to simplify the administrative procedures that we have. I see in defense today we have no time. We need to have quicker ways of indeed respecting, the regulations that we have that protect people, protect the environment, but speed it up in what we need to do so that, companies can start working properly. And even if the mine was open today, it will take, 5-6 years until
2030, they said.
Yeah, until it actually produces stuff. So, but if there are too many administrative tasks and hurdles before that, it might be 2035 or 40 before it is open. So I think, we need to play kind of safe with the people, and we need to play safe with ourselves and our sovereignty. And I think it goes because France has electricity, cheap electricity, because of our, investment in nuclear energy for a very long time. So we need to continue relying on that and investing in renewable energy as well. And all of that will mean that we will have the proper balance, that we are not going to be in crisis once the fossil energy goes up or is short. It's short.
And we heard that clip of the French president. Competition will be stiff. Chinese constructor CATL on Tuesday unveiled a car battery that can go from 10 to a 98% charge in 6.5 minutes, and another that can power an electric vehicle for 1,500 kilometers. You heard Jan Razenow, that bit of China bashing in that short clip of Emmanuel Macron that we played earlier. You heard as well Philippe Charles bemoaning the sputtering auto industry we have on this continent. Your thoughts on how fast this transition away from fossil fuels can go in the face of the emergency faced by the planet?
It's me?
Jan Razenow.
Oh, sorry.
It can go faster than we expect. We have seen significant increase in demand. When you look at the number of people who are now looking at electric vehicles, just to stay with that topic for another minute, we've seen in some countries more than double the number of people looking for electric cars than before the crisis. We also see in many countries now a real surge of rooftop solar, because that's become a lot more affordable. And we see more interest in technologies like heat pumps. So clearly the war is driving the transition in two different directions. In one direction is that, yes, we see record profits for oil and gas companies and more investment in oil and gas infrastructure to fill the gap that the current war is leaving. But we're also seeing increased interest in clean energy technologies from consumers. And I think that is very encouraging. This is not a short-term fix. Don't get me wrong. This is not going to solve the problem in the next few months, but a structural shift away from imports, and Europe relies so heavily on imports of gas and oil in particular, is the only long-term solution, unless we discover very large oil and gas reserves in Europe and we forgo the climate targets. But I don't see anyone arguing for that currently in charge of energy policy at European Union level.
Noam Radin, are you rolling your eyes listening to this conversation, thinking this isn't going to solve the immediate crisis to hand? Or are you saying, pondering perhaps the irony that you have a U.S. president who's so much bashed the switch to renewables and has us talking about them right now?
Yeah, it's a topic you can address from multiple angles. I agree with my colleague earlier said. At times of wars, conflicts, and crises, like the crisis we're seeing in the Middle East, the topic of substitution will emerge. You're going to see a lot of headlines about some countries increasing the use probably of EVs or thinking of increasing manufacturing. But we need to accept the reality that for now, oil and gas will continue playing a key role in the global economy. Anyways, you do need oil and gas in order to manufacture a lot of items that go into the production of low carbon technologies. So it's very important to emphasize that. This brings me to, again, back to the Middle East region and the importance of this region for global oil and gas flows. You can have some countries like the United States and even others trying to serve as alternatives to the gap that we're seeing from the Middle East. But again, in giant markets like Asia, you still need Middle Eastern flows. You can have alternatives now, right, to address the gap. But this does not mean that we can just let go of the oil flows from the Middle East region, from Saudi Arabia, from Iraq. And let me remind you that Iraq is OPEC's second largest oil producer. Iraq is unable to export anything from the southern region via the Strait of Hormuz. They're trying now to truck some fuel oil, specifically to Syria, and export it from the Mediterranean. Is this a viable alternative? Absolutely not. Iraq used to export around more than 3 million barrels per day from Basra in the south via Hormuz, specifically to the Asian market. These are not going there. And Asia still needs Middle Eastern flows, and we cannot just say, that's fine, United States and others can fill the gap. And let's remember that China even have export controls now, meaning this is also putting pressure on refined products like jet fuel and even diesel. You have, when it comes to jet fuel, which you mentioned earlier, we have around 450,000 barrels per day out of the Middle East. These have been stalled now because of what Iran is doing in the Strait of Hormuz. So back again to the main topic, Iran knows exactly what it's doing in the Strait of Hormuz. It is keeping a chokehold on the global economy. And again, we should not expect them to let go of this control anytime soon without extracting concessions. Specifically, I do not see them letting oil tankers pass easily via the Strait of Hormuz.
Interesting what you say, Noam, about the demand from Asia, which will continue to rely on the Gulf. We've seen countries in the last 4 years, like India and Pakistan, where the percentage of solar has shot up just in the last 4 years. Is there a sort of a ceiling to that, a plateau? Because we've seen that the numbers are on the rise, but is there a glass ceiling when it comes to how much renewables you can put in the mix?
We can talk about diversification. A lot of countries have been diversifying, even trying to diversify their economies even before the war. Even Saudi Arabia, even the United Arab Emirates, these are top oil and gas producers in the Middle East, and they were working on diversifying. But again, you cannot say we can just go with renewables and we don't need oil and gas at all. Again, a lot of, parts that go into manufacturing low carbon technologies like solar panels still require oil and gas. So oil and gas is going to continue playing a role even in the production of low carbon technologies. So again, this is why we call it diversifying and not saying renewables just completely displacing oil and gas. I don't see it at all working like that.
All right, when we compare this current global shock to previous ones, the most recent example, it was brought up earlier by Iranwar, was when Europe suddenly had to wean itself off of Russian oil and gas. 4 years on, that is still happening after 4 years after the full-scale invasion of Ukraine in 2022. Now, on that score, there's some news. Brussels breathing a bit of a sigh of relief this Wednesday after Hungarians ousted the pro-Putin Viktor Orban, and Budapest lifted its objections to a 90 billion euro lifeline for Ukraine. This in exchange for Ukraine finishing the fix of the Druzhba pipeline, which pumps Russian oil to places like Hungary and Slovakia. The oil just started flowing this Wednesday. But Moscow's keeping the EU on edge. The Druzhba pipeline used to ship oil from Kazakhstan to Germany as well. The Russian deputy prime minister announcing that Moscow will be cutting the flow as of May the 1st, citing, quote, technical possibilities. It's got the Germans scrambling. The Berlin area gets 17% of its oil from Kazakhstan and needs it to provide fuel to Berlin.
We had talks about this last week with our Kazakh partners. The Germans have given up on Russian oil, so they're doing fine.
So they're doing fine. Your reaction in Conway Mouet?
Well, no, they're not doing fine because the Germans made the decision to rely mainly on Russian oil and gas years back, and they also gave up all their nuclear energy plants.
What do you make of this Russian? What do you make of this Russian announcement that you don't need the oil from Kazakhstan anymore? We're cutting it through the Druzhba pipeline.
Well, this is all linked to the support to Ukraine that Europe is providing, and Russia is going through a very tormented time in economic terms. They absolutely need, and the war in Iran now is actually helping them big time because they're actually selling and making more profit to actually feed their war economy. Because otherwise they're not doing very well. Of course, the Russian people are not going to rebel against Vladimir Putin. Unfortunately, that never happens in an autocracy. But at the same time, we see that Russia is really, really struggling at the moment. So this is a game to play, and by putting pressure on the Europeans that have just now voted also the 90 billion loan to Ukraine. So, but I think it's all at the political level. It's what's happening with Iran as well.
Pete Shally, we began this show talking about how Iran has cards when it's negotiating with the United States. How much does Russia have leverage over the European Union right now?
It's always the same. They have big leverage, but now the leverage is not so big. They had on the gas, because gas and oil are very different, because oil can circulate extremely easily everywhere in the world. And so when you lose when you lose gas, oil somewhere, you can recover another place. So I would say that even if Russia cut oil to Germany by this oil pipe, it will not struggle Germany, because Germany can recover oil by sea from other places. Because again, oil, if you put the price and the money on the table, circulate extremely easily, like liquefied natural gas is the same. So I would say that now, according to Russia, we have cut practically all the gas, not all, because we are still importing a lot of liquefied natural gas from Russia. But I would say the pipe gas are practically the volume is very small. So I would say that Russia has no more very big leverage to penalize Europe. It was not the case in 2022, and this is the big difference between the two crises. The crisis in 2022 was essentially for Europe a gas crisis. Today it's a world oil crisis, and the price of oil is a world price. And so I would say that today I am not very worried on, I would say, the volume we can have, and so on the. But I'm more worried on the prices. The problem today is much more prices than availability of oil in Europe.
Prices that hurt people who are
yes,
struggling.
Of course, that people suffer. But finally, today we can see that there is no pénurie, je sais plus comment on dit.
Shortage.
Yeah. There is no real shortage in France.
But the prices are going up.
But the prices are going up because we pay more to attract oil to us, because oil can always come.
All right. So, Jan Razanau, your thoughts on, we talked earlier about Europe being at a disadvantage when it's trying to take on China when it comes to renewables. How much of what's the state of play, if you will, for a country like Germany, when it gets the news that the Russians are cutting their flow of Kazakh oil?
It's not good news, is it? I mean, yeah, we're looking at a situation in Europe where about 95% of all the oil is imported at the moment, and just under 90% of all the natural gas is imported as well, and increasingly through LNG, as was said before. And yeah, that is a dangerous level of exposure, I'd argue. And especially Germany, relying so heavily still on oil from Russia, is certainly at risk here. When you look at the dependence of German industry in particular, I mean, that is one of the key issues that we still use primarily fossil fuels in the end use sector. So we've done quite well when it comes to electricity, lots of renewables, and that's all great, but that's only about 20% of our energy use. And the other 80%, we've barely scratched the surface, even though technically we could do an awful lot more. Like industrial electrification could offer you up to maybe even 90% technically, but the economics often don't stack up. And that is why we're still so dependent on imported fossil fuels. Yeah, but it's a terrible situation to be in.
So let me ask you, Jan, a domestic German politics question here. We've seen the surge of the pro-Russian far-right AfD party. News like the one we're talking about right now today, does that help the AfD more or not?
Well, it's a difficult question. I mean, we've seen a real polarization around energy. And there has been a narrative that these high energy prices somehow are linked to the transition. And clearly, that's not the case when we look at the current crisis here. This is fundamentally triggered by geopolitical tensions in the Middle East. That's pretty obvious to anyone. But there is a narrative, and that's still very strong, that's also being discussed in sort of parts of the political debate in Germany. This is certainly something that will help some politicians who construct a narrative that this is all the fault of green policies and what have you. But really, it isn't. And I think we should be serious about this crisis because it deserves seriousness, given that it's affecting billions of people all around the world.
Noam Rayton, there was that piece last weekend in the Wall Street Journal that sort of an inside the White House piece where they talked about a Donald Trump who doesn't want to be like the situation that Jimmy Carter was with when there were the hostages in the embassy in Tehran and where there were eight U.S. soldiers who were killed in a failed rescue operation. But is the proper comparison, is the Jimmy Carter comparison the right one with the energy crisis? Does Donald Trump, will he face an energy crisis now for the rest of his tenure, or will this pass quickly?
My only comment on that is back to what Jan said earlier. We really cannot underestimate the crisis in the Middle East. It will affect every single country, including the United States, where consumers are already feeling the rise in gasoline prices. So this is the only comment I can share on this, that it's going to affect every country and no country will be spared from the effects of what's happening in the Middle East.
And you heard Philippe Charlet saying how, explaining to us how even if you have a lot of oil, the prices still go up at the pump because it's a global market. Why didn't the U.S. president see this?
I don't know. I don't have a comment on the U.S. Foreign policy, but we saw how the war evolved, how it unfolded. And did we all see that the Iranians were going to close the Strait of Hormuz and have all the ramification we're seeing right now on the global economy? Absolutely not. So as the war unfolded, we started seeing that the Iranians were willing to use that card, which is controlled transit in the Strait of Hormuz, which is something they wielded this threat in the past and they never used it. But now it seems that they see that they need to survive, and they see that there's a war that is coming against them, and that's why they resorted to that card, which is the Strait of Hormuz, controlling transit there, and they knew that there will be ramifications, and these are affecting everyone now. So I cannot tell you if everyone really was able to forecast the ramifications or the Iranian decision to take control of transit in the Strait of Hormuz.
Noam Rayton, we'll have to leave it there. So many thanks for joining us from Washington. I want to thank as well Jan Rosenau for being with us from Oxford in England. Hélène Conway-Mouret. Also want to thank Philippe Charlet. Thank you for being with us here in the France 24 debate.